Thank you, ladies. Let's turn in our Bibles to Ecclesiastes chapter 12. If you're using the Bible in the hymn rack in front of you, you'll find Ecclesiastes 12 on page 482 of the front section, or the Old Testament of that Bible. We have two sermons left in our Ecclesiastes series. This one, and then next week we will finish it out. This week we'll look through verse 8 of Ecclesiastes 12, and then we'll finish out the chapter, the last 5 verses next week. Pastor Jason will conclude us there. And as we wrap up Ecclesiastes, it makes me start to think a little bit about final lines. I'm a big reader. I enjoy stories of kind of any kind. I enjoy movies, TV shows. As long as they tell a good story, I'm all in. But books is probably my main one where I get most of my stories. And one of my favorite final lines out of any book of all time, this probably won't surprise most of you who know me, is from Lord of the Rings. The final sentence of this incredible epic story that spans 3 books. Large books, like paperweight kind of books that you slam on your desk and make loud noises with, is very simple, 3 words. One character by the name of Sam says this: "Well, I'm back." So that seems like a really simple, understated line to be one of your favorite end lines of all stories of all times, but it's such a great final line. You see, Sam's not actually even the main character. He's kind of a helper to the main character. But he is the main character of what's going to happen next. So it's appropriate that he's the one that says it, because like all great stories, Lord of the Rings ends letting you know it's just part of a bigger story. There's more to come. And the line's simple, it's understated, but it's so satisfactory. It fits the character of Sam. It fits him as what's called a hobbit in the story, kind of a little homebody kind of character. It fits the place that he lives, the Shire, which is very much about being home and being comfortable and being quiet. And frankly, the whole story revolves around getting back home. I mean, Frodo, Sam's friend and main character, his whole point in the story is to destroy the bad guy's ring so that he can save his home, so that his home doesn't be destroyed. Throughout the entire book, the thing that motivates Frodo and then Sam as his helper is their thoughts and their memories of getting back home. And while for most of the book, Frodo assumes he's never returning home, there's never once in the entire book where Sam assumes he's never going back home. For him, it's a given. When it's all over, I'll be back. And so at the end of everything that happens and all of the pieces and all of the parts and all of the journeys that the characters go through, Sam wraps the entire story up by walking into his home, sitting down on a bench, and saying, "Well, I'm back. I'm back." In my opinion, the stories with the best last lines are the stories where that last line hints at more to come. Not cliffhangers, that's no fun. But they say, hey, there's more to this story. It's bigger than just this story. They fit the character and the situation. They show the themes and the ideas that the story holds dear. And I have a whole list of books and movies and TV shows where the last line is just so perfect. And at this point, as we wrap up Ecclesiastes, we're looking at some of Solomon's last lines. He's going to approach his last thoughts and his last idea from kind of 2 angles. And we'll look at one this week, and Pastor Jason will look at that angle, the other angle next week, Lord willing. But they're the same thought. And having made all of his conclusions and offered all of his final suggestions that we've already discussed, Solomon leaves us with one final thought. He says essentially this: if life is indeed inscrutable, unexplainable, and mysterious. If circumstances are beyond our control, and whatever God says is going to happen is what's going to happen, not us, if there's no guarantees that if I do something good, good things will happen, and if someone else does something bad, bad things will happen to them, and if death does indeed level the playing field and everyone, wise, foolish, wicked, righteous, rich, poor, everyone meets the same end, Solomon says, then we should remember our Creator before that end arrives. That's it. It's short. It's simple. It's understated. But is it really appropriate as Solomon's last idea? What is it about this instruction in Solomon's mind that's so vital in wrapping up his purpose and intent for even writing this book? I mean, what is Solomon even saying with this simple statement, remember your Creator before the end arrives? Well, I think this morning, I'd like to take that statement, remember your Creator before the end arrives, and just kind of work through it word by word and see if we can understand what it means and how it fits in with Solomon's argument throughout the rest of the book. So let's start with that very first word, remember. Now your notes note that this is in verse 1, but it's also later on in the passage, in verse 6. He says remember twice. So this is a significant part of what he's trying to get to. And often when you and I use the word remember, we're engaging in kind of an intellectual exercise. We're sitting on a porch swing, sipping iced tea, if you like that kind of stuff. And you're reminiscing about your childhood or your first job or that one spring day that was so great, or when the Broncos used to be good, right? Or you're remembering something because you're trying to pull information from it, right? You're like, what did that person look like? Or which password goes with this website? Or, man, where did I put my keys? It's simply a matter of recall or reminiscence, right? But when Solomon talks about remembering, and frankly, when ancient Israel in general talked about remembering, it was more than simply an intellectual exercise. We see throughout the Old Testament that remembering is more than simply something you do with your mind. And there's some places where this shows up very clearly. In Genesis 7 through 9, we read the story of the global flood, right? God told Noah to build an ark, so Noah builds the ark, he collects the animals, and then God floods the earth with rain. And amid all the chaos and all the animals and all the rain, the main point of the story becomes very clear in Genesis 8, verse 1, when we're told that God remembered Noah. Now, we know from what we know about who God is that God doesn't forget stuff. He's omniscient. He knows everything, which means he can't forget things. It's impossible. So what does it mean here that God remembered Noah? It's not that God forgot him. Rather, God gave his full attention to Noah. He turned his favor and his face towards Noah. Noah became the object of God's interest rather than the wrath he was pouring out on the earth. We see it also show up later as God gives Israel the 10 Commandments in the law in Exodus chapter 20. God commands Israel as part of those 10 Commandments to remember the Sabbath day. Now, is God worried that his people are going to forget a day of the week? Like, if they forget it, it won't happen? Like, how do you forget something that can't be skipped? You can't miss Saturday because you forgot about it. Oops, I forgot Saturday, must not have happened. God's not concerned that the Sabbath is something that they would forget about and miss. He's not concerned that it's going to somehow become like that week between Christmas and New Year's where you're never sure what day it is or what in the world is even going on. I mean, we had 2 snow days this past week, and in our house, Thursday, it felt like Friday, it felt like Saturday. It was very strange. But God tells Israel exactly what he means by remember the Sabbath day. He tells them they remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. He's not really worried about them forgetting the 7th day of the week. God's concern is that the Jewish people keep the Sabbath. Remembering means that they need to give it attention, but they also need to do something with that attention. It's not just that they're paying attention to it, it's that that attention translates into action. And he models this. We see it very clearly in Leviticus, where throughout God's giving of the law to Israel, he tells them that one of the reasons for them to keep the law is so that God will remember his covenant with them. And he says it repeatedly. You have Leviticus 26:45 in your notes, but he says this multiple times throughout his giving of the law, that God, if they keep their covenant, will remember his covenant with Abraham and with Isaac and with Jacob. Again, God isn't forgetting something. For God to remember his covenant with Israel is him promising to keep his covenant with Israel. And ultimately, that's why we're told God remembered Noah. He was preparing to make good on the promise that he gave to Noah, that you'll survive this thing. One more. Let's look at a negative example. In Judges, we meet a guy named Gideon. He's threshing wheat in a valley, which makes 0 sense. But he's doing it because he's scared. He's faithless. He's timid. And yet God has decided to use him to deliver Israel from an occupying nation. And one of the first acts that Gideon undertakes is to cast down the false gods that Israel has been serving. He casts down these altars or these idols to Baal. And once Gideon proceeds to liberate the nation, and there's all sorts of kind of unsavory stuff that happens afterwards. I mean, it's Judges, so. But generally, after that all happens, Israel continues to worship God rather than Baal until Gideon dies. And when Gideon dies, we're told that Israel does not remember God. And as a result, they begin to worship Baal again. And again, the act of remembering is more than simply intellectually recalling something. It's not as if they were like, oh, we forgot about Yahweh. There must be another God for us to worship. There was action involved with remembering. They forgot God by worshiping someone else. You see, remembering has to do with activity, not just thought. And this is normal for us. We lump these this groups of commands into one simple shorthand command all the time, right? I mean, when I tell my kids to look at me, I'm not really just looking for eye contact. I want that, but there's more. I want them to stand still. I want them to be quiet. I want them to open their ears and listen to what I have to say. And I want them to do what I'm about to tell them. All of that is wrapped up when I say, look at me. We often use shorthand phrases like this to mean more than just the simple action of that word. And God does it often as well. When he tells Israel to hear, it's shorthand for listen and obey. So Solomon, alongside his instructions to risk, rejoice, and remove, like we talked about last week, is telling us that to live life under the sun, to flourish under the sun, we must remember. We must remember. But what is it that we're supposed to remember? God remembered Noah and saved him. Israel remembered the Sabbath and kept it. God remembered his covenant and fulfilled it. Israel didn't remember God and followed other gods. So what does Solomon want us to remember? Well, he wants us to remember our Creator. And this is a striking title. At least it should be, if we're paying attention. This is the only time in all of Solomon's writings, Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, and the couple of Psalms that he wrote, where he references God as creator. Now, he's talked about the act of creation about 4 times so far in Ecclesiastes, but he's not actually called God the creator. He's talked about things being made, and even at least once talking about God making them, but he's never really referenced God as creator. Frankly, up to this point, God's been kind of a bit player in all of Solomon's explorations, right? I mean, Solomon's kind of intentionally removed him from the discussion. That's part of the whole point of looking at life under the sun is let's take God out of the picture and see how life looks. And when God does show up, he's mostly a distant third party who's been brought in because the only thing we can do to explain what's going on around us is say, oh, it must be God. So it seems odd that Solomon would make him the key to living life under the sun. But if we've been paying attention, it shouldn't really surprise us, right? I mean, Solomon can't really discuss life without God without bringing God back into the picture. God keeps popping back into the conversation, whether that's because life is too dark without God or because there's no way to make sense of life without him. It's probably both of those things. We don't really know. But Solomon just can't keep God out of the conversation. He hasn't been able to the entire book. Why? Why? Well, because God is the designer, sustainer, and controller of all of life and all of existence. And to try and understand life apart from him doesn't work. The reason Solomon can't minimize God's influence is because God is the only influence. You see, this title is not just a striking title because he doesn't use it very often. It's also a recognition of God's absolute sovereignty over all things. This is a sovereign title, and God's sovereignty is the point that he's making by calling God the creator. It's clear that one of Solomon's points in writing Ecclesiastes is to combat the idea that you and I have any sort of control over anything. This is one of the most seductive and pernicious lies that we believe. And we find ourselves believing it again and again and again and again. I can control my own circumstances. And here's the deal. It's not a new lie either. It's the same lie that caught Adam and Eve in the garden all the way back at the beginning. God doesn't control your fate. You'll not surely die. You do. Oh, you'll be like God if you eat that fruit. But all it takes to dispel this lie is an honest look at life under the sun. See, there's no meaning to work or wealth or power. Wisdom only makes things hurt less. Justice seems to be some sort of cosmic joke, and frankly, the only relief is death, which really isn't any sort of comfort because that's not very helpful. The futility and incomprehensibility of life under the sun comes from the fact that we control nothing. It's all random. And it all keeps happening again and again and again and again, no matter what we do. So Solomon is trying throughout the book to deprive us of anything and everything we could possibly look to for control or purpose. And he's going to point out that nothing fills that spot but God himself. And so he's going to commend to us that we remember, follow, obey, submit ourselves to God, not simply because he's a better option, but because he's the only option. There's not another one that does anything to make life better. And that's why Solomon assigns him the title of creator here. It's not simply just the fact that God started it all. God's position as creator here and in the rest of the Bible is the truth that God designed, made, sustains, and controls the entirety of existence from the beginning to the end and beyond. Which is a pretty massive claim. So let me say it again. God's position as creator, both here and in the rest of the Bible, is the truth that God designed, made, sustains, and controls the entirety of existence from the beginning to the end and beyond. What does that even mean? That's huge. What does it even mean? Well, let's break it down really fast. God designed it all. God laid the plans and worked out the details. He gets to say what's right and what's wrong. He gets to say what is a boy and what is a girl. He said what hands and eyes and tongues are for. He's in charge. He says who's in charge and what they should do. He planned how it was all going to be laid out. He decided how to hang planets in space. He set boundaries on oceans and seas. He picked what animals are here and which ones aren't. Every purpose, every intent, every meaning, every boundary, every constant, every season, reality itself finds its design and definition from God and God alone. He designed it all. But the fact that he's the creator isn't just the fact that he designed it all, he also made it all. God's not some sort of creative genius who hands his work off to someone else to execute. And besides, every designer knows you don't hand stuff off to people who are going to mess it up. You make sure either that the person you're handing it off to is going to fulfill your vision, or you do it on your own. And the only one with the power and the authority and the ability to make God's designs reality was God himself. He's omnipotent. Nothing is stronger or more capable than he is. So every detail of every design was meticulously and lovingly overseen by his powerful ability. From the design of the most massive galaxy or star to the rarest of molecules and microbes. He's the God who breathes out stars and counts hairs on heads. He palms the universe in his hand, and he sees when a sparrow falls. Nothing shows God's absolute raw power, his brute force, his massively broad shoulders, than the fact that he created everything by speaking. And it'd be an incredible feat of power if God merely made the universe, but God also sustains the universe. With all of its wildness and all of its complexity and all of its beauty, God sustains every aspect of creation from the moment he made it until now. And we're talking a whole nother level now of power, control, something. He's on a whole different plane than just having made it by sustaining it. You see, Psalm 104 goes on at length about God's sustaining work in creation. God's the one who stretches out the sky as a tent each day. He's the one who directs the winds to blow where they do and bring the weather patterns that they bring. He's the one who keeps the earth firm on its foundations in the vacuum of space. He's the one who flooded and deflooded the earth, forming the mountains and the valleys. He's the one who sets the boundaries for waters and patrols the waters to make sure they're keeping the boundaries. He's the one who sends forth streams and springs and rivers to nourish the earth. He's the one who causes grass to grow and trees to bloom. He's the one who creates homes for birds and goats and lions. He provides prey for the predators. He causes the rising and the setting of the sun. He oversees currents in the ocean and jet streams in the sky and the rain and the snow and the clouds. And that's all in one day's work. He does it day in and day out, day in and day out for all of time. And he doesn't just sustain creation. He sustains us. Our hearts beat because of God. Our brain's neurons fire because of him. Our lungs expand and contract because of him. Each and every person is a walking, breathing, circulating, thinking miracle for every second of every day, and God makes it happen. But God is not just the author of creation. He manages the time and circumstances in a way that no one else could. He controls it. God's not a bit player who sits back and watches how all of his creation works. He doesn't just push the marble and watch it run down the track, and when something goes off track, he goes, oops. He's in active control of it in a way no one else can be. Nations rise and fall because God oversees it. Tires go flat and branches fall on houses because of God. Promotions are awarded and milestones are reached because of God. We grow old and make families and leave legacies and are forgotten because of God. Each and every moment of your life happens under the watchful care and control of God. Nothing, and I mean nothing, happens outside of his knowledge. And Solomon speaks to it here in Ecclesiastes. In Ecclesiastes 3, he says that God has made everything appropriate in its time. Ecclesiastes 7, he says, in the days of prosperity be happy, but in the day of adversity consider God made one as well as the other. And again, we're told in Ecclesiastes 7:29 that God made men upright. He had an intent, but man chooses his directions. And Ecclesiastes 11, just last week that we looked at, says, just as you don't know the path of the wind or how bones are formed in the womb of the pregnant woman, so you don't know the activity of a God who makes all things. This is bigger and grander and more than we could ever fathom. Are you overwhelmed? Are you tired? Are you humbled by this? You ready for more? Because what if I told you that God's sovereignty, his control, his creatorness is actually bigger than what we just went through? We spend all day trying to soar to the heights of what this means or mind the depths of what this means. We could spend weeks attempting to put some sort of limits or boundaries on his perfections, or we could simply acknowledge this morning, as Solomon does here, that he's the creator with everything that entails. See, however overwhelmed or awed you are by God, that's exactly Solomon's point. Life under the sun will always be unsatisfactory because of sin. And the only way to flourish, to risk, to rejoice, to remove, is if your view of God and your response to him is right-sized. So unless you see God as the creator, the designer, the maker, the sustainer, and the controller of all creation, you will constantly and always be frustrated with life under the sun. And here's the deal. The need for you to recognize and respond to God in a right-sized way has a deadline, Solomon says. 3 times he's going to remind us. In this passage, there's an expiration date on this. He says we have to do this before something. Now, I'm going to acknowledge, prepositions aren't really a super exciting part of grammar. Okay? One of the best reasons for knowing what they are is so that you can remove them from the sentence so you can analyze the sentence better. Like, let's get the prepositions out of there so we can actually read the sentence better, okay? And it's not like they're wildly varied. I mean, you probably memorized a list of them when you were in grade school, right? Aboard, about, above, across, after, against, along, amid, blah, 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 blah. You're like, this never served me ever out of high school for the rest of my life. But here it is, stuck in my head. You see, the only thing they're useful for, as grammarians so helpfully put it, is showing relationships, which is so general and vague that it means almost nothing. Teaching what prepositions are for is absolutely one of the hardest things in grammar. It is. Like, kids constantly asking, what is this for? It shows a relationship. What does that mean? Well, these two words relate to each other. Shows you. But the preposition before is an essential preposition in this passage. See, Solomon is warning us that something is coming which will render us incapable of remembering our Maker. There will come a point where we will not be able to do this. There will come a time when you will not be able to remember your Maker. You see, Solomon is directing this instruction to the young, not because those who are old can't remember their Creator. They absolutely can. And not even because young people tend to forget their Creator. And it's not because young people have more time and more energy to devote to this pursuit. It's true that they do. Solomon's directing this to younger people and those who haven't yet done it. Why? Because establishing a pattern early in life that God, the Creator God, the sovereign God, the all-controlling God, has the final say on how and why I live my life will make for the most fulfilling and most satisfying way to live life under the sun. The sooner we make a habit of remembering God, the longer we have to flourish under the sun. So Solomon says this is urgent. There's a deadline. Don't delay, Solomon says. Don't hold back. No excuses, no delays, no distractions. 3 times he reminds us, before. Do this before. But before what? What? He says, do this before the end comes. Before the end arrives. Now, speaking of prepositions, well, they may not be exciting. They get really weird fast if there's not an object of the preposition. Imagine if Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon and said, this is one small step for, one giant leap for. And everyone listening went, for what? What is he even talking about? Solomon provides for us 2 scenarios for what? What do we need to do this before? Before what? The first one is the end of our abilities. In verses 2 through 5, he gives us a poem about growing old. An extended series of metaphors that describe aging. Growing old, he says, is like a gathering storm that darkens the natural lights and will simply produce unending rain. And even when you'd expect that storm to clear, the rain stops. It doesn't really, it's just replaced by more clouds. A good night's sleep isn't something that just dispels old age. It's like a house that's slowly falling into decay. The keepers of the house, the arms begin to tremble. The strong ones of the house, or the legs, begin to bend. The grinders or the teeth are few and don't work as well as they used to. The windows or the eyes are dimmed by cataracts and oncoming blindness. The doors or the ears are closed in deafness. The singers or the vocal cords don't work as well as they used to. And the white blossoms of the almond trees adorn one's head with white hair. And he throws in some other things that might be familiar. Older people have trouble sleeping, and they arise at the sound of a bird. There's more fear, whether heights are being taken advantage of, since the bodies and minds are more frail than their youth. The strength that they had is done. They don't leap like a grasshopper should anymore. They drag along the ground. And nothing really gives pizzazz or excitement to life anymore. Nothing really spices it up like a caperberry should. Now, Solomon's not making fun of old people or suggesting that they're worthless or just a waste of space or anything like that. Solomon's making it clear to those who are younger, to those who haven't experienced it, that getting older takes its toll. And it's not as easy as some folks make it look. So you should establish a pattern of remembering your Creator now, before you have the burdens of old age to worry about. But that's not the only end he's warning us of. He warns us of the end of our life. Verses 6 and 7 are actually a poem not about old age, but about death. You see, that process of aging eventually stops. The silver cord breaks, the golden bowl is crushed, the water pitcher is shattered, the well wheel is destroyed. And in case you miss what Solomon's saying, he ends by invoking the curse from Genesis chapter 3, to dust you shall return. Eventually, we all die. Our bodies decay, and our spirit leaves this under the sun life to live under a different sun. You see, as in the rest of Ecclesiastes, Solomon isn't spending time here focusing on death because he's morbid or macabre. He's speaking of death differently, though, than he did before. Before, he would speak of death as part of the futility of life, part of the senselessness and the incomprehensibility of life. Death happened to everyone, and no one escapes its indignities. And since you're dead, and the things you do in life have no meaning and purpose. That's how he's talked about death so far. But here, instead of speaking about death as something that creates absurdity in life, he paints death as the thing that brings focus to our life. And again, just as his approach with God, Solomon reveals his full hand here at the end. He's not spent so much time reminding us of our impending doom to bring us to despair. That's not why he's brought up death so much. He's suggesting that because of the reality and inevitability of death, we should start living our lives from there. If we're all going to die and leave little to nothing behind, then how should we live? Solomon asks, should we live for pleasure or wealth or work or power? Should we drown our disappointments in entertainment and denial? Should we despair at the injustice and difficulty that we see of those around us experience? Should we give up and give in? Should we throw in the towel on doing what's right? Should we bow our knee to corrupt and weak leaders who are foolish and wicked? Should we expect an immediate return on wisdom and clean living? And the answer that Solomon has come to for all of those questions is a resounding no. Don't live that way. Why? Because death is coming. If we're all going to die, then we should be busy now about the one thing that matters. Living our lives by the design of our sovereign Creator. He made us. He designed us. He oversees our days and experiences. His design is the best design by which to live. Not ours. We're weak. We're foolish. We're feeble. We're easily distracted and easily deceived. He's set for us a standard of what's right and what's good and what's proper. His order is the design that's most fulfilling, most joy-producing, most satisfying. You see, by bringing up our inevitable death, Solomon isn't suggesting we remember our Maker because of duty or obligation or because there's simply no other options. He's suggesting that remembering our Creator is the only path to living the life that God intended for us. It's the only way to flourish under the sun. It's a joy to remember our Creator, not an obligation. Why? Because He designed us for it. He made us for Him. And we're hungry until we have Him. I don't know about you, but for me, this whole thing brings up a very simple question. That's how. I mean, if remember means that I ought to do something, it's more than simply recalling information, right? I'm supposed to do something with what I recall. What do I do? What actions do I do that demonstrate I'm remembering my Creator? Now, there's a sense in which our response ought to be just kind of a simple, natural result of us knowing who God is, right? If God's in absolute control, I rest. I enjoy God's good gifts. I stop working so hard to make my life work. I stop trying to make it all make sense. But I think there's some very specific actions that we can take that follow naturally from remembering our Creator. So how do we remember our Creator? How do we do this? Number one, we worship. We worship Him. Now, please understand that by this, I don't simply mean singing songs or giving the offering or even simply coming to church on a Sunday morning. I don't mean less than that, for sure. But the Bible is clear that those are acts of worship that spring from a true and abiding relationship with God. But worship means so much more than those things. Let me ask you this question. What is it that ultimately drives your decision making? How do you determine the difference between what's better and what's best? What is it that you're willing or eager to shape your schedule and your agenda around? Whose pleasure means the most? Whose approval are you looking for? What is it that you center your life around? What do your hopes and your plans and your desires and your attitudes and your goals all revolve around and point to? You see, worship is more than a simple act. It's a value judgment. You're saying by worshiping something that you're placing a level of worth or value on something or someone. Our lives are going to revolve around something. Solomon's simply asking us, does your life revolve around your Creator? Or does it revolve around pleasure, or wealth, or work, or wisdom, or justice? None of those are necessarily bad things. But Solomon's whole point is if those are the things that you're worshiping, he's asking you a simple question. How's that working for you? If those are the object of your worship, how's it going? It's probably not going real well, huh? If anything but God has supreme value in your life, then none of this, Solomon says, makes sense. None of it. None of what we did this morning makes sense. Singing's weird. Why? Why would you do that? Especially with a whole bunch of other people. Like, you sing in the shower. You don't sing with other people around. And frankly, you've got better things to do with your money and your time than be here this morning, right? What? You're going to seriously use your Sunday morning to do these things? I mean, the whole Christian thing is ridiculous if God is not the supreme value of your life. And when He is, it changes everything. It changes my priorities. It changes what I pursue. It changes the things that I hold close. My worship is going to demonstrate itself in love. This is the second thing we can do, is we can love. We can love God. I think love and worship can easily be confused for each other. One's about value, the other's about treasure. One's about direction, the other one's more kind of about action. One's about setting priorities, and the other one's about protecting those priorities. You see, when you love something or someone, they become the thing that you treasure most. You hold them dear. You spend time considering them, admiring them, understanding them. You protect them at all costs. Again, Solomon's holding up our Creator as the thing to remember under the sun. And so he's asking us, is God your greatest treasure? Maybe ask it this way. Would you be okay with a heaven, streets of gold, tree of life, saints of all time, happiness, joy, pleasure forevermore? Would you be okay with that heaven if God wasn't there? I think it's easy for us to say, without a lot of thought, well, of course, I love God. But here's the thing. You are what you love. And what you love, what you treasure, what you protect and hold dear, that's going to shape you. That's going to form you. So how do you know if what you say you love is actually what you love? Well, what do your actions tell you? Where do you find refuge or safety or comfort? What makes you feel rich or prosperous? What does victory or success in your life look like? What do you think your rights are? What do you think you're entitled to? You see, your fruit is what shows your love. So the fundamental question is, do you look more like Jesus today than you did a year ago? That's going to show if you love Christ or not. Because what you love shapes you. What you worship becomes what you love, and what you love determines what you do. So the third thing I think we can do to show that we remember our Creator is to submit to God. Now, I could have used the word obey here. And I think Solomon's instruction to remember has that to it, but I think there's actually a little bit more. I think there's some more bite to what Solomon's saying here than simply obey. See, it's more than simply just doing what you're told. It's more than ticking off a list that you've been given. I mean, you can obey without really submitting. My kids do it all the time. I was discussing this sermon with a friend this weekend, and he pointed out to me a passage in a book that he'd read. And in it, the author spends pages listing the beauties, the realities, the perfections of God. He outlines exactly what we talked about this morning, that God designed, made, sustains, and controls the entire universe. All the things that we spent so much time talking about. The author then paused after spending pages dwelling on who God is and essentially asked this simple question: what do you think you're doing disobeying this God? I mean, if he's got all this power and all this might and all this influence and frankly, all these answers, why? Why? Why do we rebel? He loves us. He knows us and he knows our needs. He sent his son to die on our behalf. He conquered sin and death for us. He provided through Jesus the only way for our sinful selves to know him and dwell with him forever. He saved us from ourselves, from our sins, from our hell-bent life of destruction and relational devastation. He designed us for himself. He gave us the blueprint of that design for how we can know him, relate to him, and follow him for our greatest joy and satisfaction. And yet we still disobey. Why? Solomon is making it so abundantly clear. When we refuse to submit, when we refuse to follow, when we choose to live life by our design, by our plan, by our best efforts, it's hopeless. He says, guys, I've been there, I've done that, I got the t-shirt. It's nothing. So submit to God today. Let what he says go. Let his design shape your life. Let his desires and goals be yours. Worship him, love him, submit to him. And keep on doing it. Repeat. Repeat. This isn't a process that happens just once. This is a process that happens 1,000 times every day. We worship, we love, we submit, we repeat. Don't stop. Don't look back. Don't turn around. Don't quit. Do it again and again and again and again. Do it until it's a habit. Do it until it's natural. Do it, Solomon says, until you die. Why? Why? Well, it's simple. Because if you don't, vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Everything's vanity. Solomon spent the entire book trying to make sure that we see the emptiness and futility of living our lives for anything and anyone but God. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't fulfill. It doesn't satisfy. Pleasure's never going to be enough. Wealth will only last so long. Work produces nothing lasting. Because of sin, justice will never be completely served under the sun. Your political leaders are going to fail you. Your own power and influence will wane. Your body itself will give up and die, but God doesn't. So remember him. Worship him. Love him. Submit to him. And keep on doing it, because otherwise, it's all vanity, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities. Everything is vanity. So remember your Maker before it's too late. Let's pray. Father, we are grateful that you have given us you. That we don't have to figure out life under the sun. We don't have to figure out what's best. You've already done that. You've made us and designed us and crafted us exactly the way that you intended us to be. And you've given us a clear picture of what you intend for us. So, Father, help us to remember you. Help us to pattern our lives in such a way that it's clear that you are the object of our worship, that you are the object of our love, that you are the authority that we submit to. And we're committed to doing that again and again and again and again, because it's the only way that life under the sun makes sense. It's the only way to live a life that's fulfilling and satisfying. It's the only way to enjoy the pleasures that you've given us. It's the only way to enjoy the work that you've given us. It's the only way to enjoy and to flourish under the sun. So, Father, remind us again and again and again and again of you. We pray these things in Christ's name. Amen.